You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, now that the 165-page motion was unsealed in the D.C. prosecution against Donald Trump, there does become the worry that, for example, if Donald Trump were to win in November, that there's all this damning evidence against him, all of these co-conspirators who helped him plan his efforts to overturn the 2020 election and engage in January 6th. And so I'm wondering if, in the event, again, that he wins in November, the states could pick up where the federal government left off, because obviously his own DOJ wouldn't prosecute him, and create their own prosecutions since he wouldn't be able to pardon himself from state crimes. Can you speak on that prospect? And again, for everybody watching, this is a thought experiment here.
Yeah, Brian, if Donald Trump retakes the reign of governmental power and becomes president, it is all but guaranteed that he will not be prosecuted for any of his crimes. Not in federal court, not in state court, certainly not while he is the sitting president. We'll talk about why that is in a minute. Now, when you ask the question, can the state courts pick up where the federal government left off? It's not a straightforward answer. So we know that Donald Trump, for example, is being prosecuted in Washington, D.C. for his election subversion crimes in connection with the 2020 election, and he's being prosecuted in the state of Georgia for his election subversion crimes, specifically in Georgia, right? Trying to overturn the results of the presidential election in Georgia. Hey, just give me 11,780 votes and corruptly declare me the winner. But here's the thing. You can only bring charges against somebody in a state if they violate state law, not federal law. The feds get to charge federal crimes. The states get to charge state crimes. Now, a lot of criminal conduct, like election crimes, might end up violating the laws in both jurisdictions, state and federal. So both can proceed against somebody who violates their respective laws. And that's kind of where we are with Donald Trump right now. But now let's continue the thought experiment. What happens if, in the horrific event Donald Trump gets reelected president, what happens to all of his cases? First of all, I think we can all safely assume he will appoint a corrupt attorney general, and he will order his attorney general to dismiss the federal cases against him, all of them that might be pending when he takes office. The D.C. case, obviously, and by then I do think the Florida federal prosecution being presided over by Judge Aileen Cannon for Donald Trump unlawfully retaining classified documents, obstructing justice, and violating our nation's espionage laws, that will probably be back in existence because the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals will probably overturn Judge Cannon's dismissal and reinstate it. But it won't matter because Donald Trump will order his Department of Justice to dismiss it. So let's turn to the state cases. Let's assume the Georgia state case is still up and running against Donald Trump on January 20th, when, God forbid, he's sworn in. Here's what happens. The United States Constitution has something called the Supremacy Clause. Boiled down to its essence, the Supremacy Clause stands for the proposition that a federal law that conflicts with a state law, the federal law takes precedent and the federal law takes precedent and the state law yields. It falls. So here's what I believe Donald Trump will do if he becomes president again. He will say, listen, the Department of Justice has announced a legal principle, setting aside that a legal principle announced by DOJ is not a law. It is an interpretation of laws and the Constitution. In any event, he will say the DOJ has announced that a sitting president can't be prosecuted. Therefore, by operation of the Supremacy Clause, I can't be prosecuted by the state of Georgia, and I can't be prosecuted federally. Of course, that won't matter because he'll have complete control, a stranglehold over the Department of Justice, so there will be no federal prosecutions against him. Now, Brian, we could spend an hour doing a legal breakdown, Crim Law 101 class on whether that is a sound legal argument, the Supremacy Clause argument I just made. There are pros and cons to it. It might not stand up in court, but what I can promise you is it will be a winning argument with Donald Trump in the Oval Office. Why? Because Donald Trump will say, listen, I don't really care what the state court in Georgia says about my Supremacy Clause issue. I'll order military troops to Georgia if need be to make sure they can't prosecute me. He's already talked about weaponizing the military and using it to enforce civilian law, which is a violation of a federal law called the Posse Comitatus Act, which says military troops cannot be involved in enforcing civilian law. None of that, Brian, will matter to Donald Trump. So, now that I think the thought experiment has taken us to a place where Donald Trump will not be prosecuted, either in federal court or in any state court, at least while he's a sitting president, we can certainly move on and talk about the implications for all of his co-conspirators, his dirty lawyers who are co-conspirator 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the D.C. indictment.
I feel like I know exactly what you're going to say, and it has a whole lot to do with pardons.
So all of the federal charges against all of Donald Trump's co-conspirators, his criminal associates, his lackeys, his flunkies, his lapdogs, his sycophants, I think I've covered them all. Any federal charges against those people, he will do one of two things. He will order his Department of Justice to dismiss them, and maybe he'll go with a belt and suspenders approach to doling out benefits to his criminal associates, and he will also pardon them. But, as we know, a presidential pardon only extinguishes federal charges, federal crimes. Let's move down to Georgia, where Donald Trump's dirty lawyers, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, John Eastman, Kenneth Chesebro, among others, are criminally indicted with him. They are his RICO co-conspirators, co-defendants in the case down in Georgia. Now, that case would survive Donald Trump becoming president. Why? Because the Supremacy Clause has nothing to do with prosecutions in state courts against Donald Trump's co-conspirators, his dirty lawyers. So ultimately, what does that mean for state court prosecutions against the Rudy Giulianis and the Sidney Powells of the world? It means that Donald Trump would literally have to act in a completely lawless way, saying, listen, I don't care what the state courts are trying to do. These are my criminal associates, my co-conspirators. These are the lawyers who did my dirty bidding by, among other things, filing more than 60 bogus, baseless, frivolous lawsuits trying to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. And I will do whatever I need, including misusing the Department of Justice and the military to protect my criminal associates. That would be completely lawless. So if we back up, Brian, the Supremacy Clause might actually give Donald Trump a legitimate and lawful claim that state courts cannot prosecute him while he's sitting president, but it does nothing to protect or shield his dirty lawyers, his co-conspirators, his criminal associates. So Donald Trump would have to go 100% lawless to do those favors for the Rudy Giulianis of the world. What do you think the odds are that Donald Trump would be all too willing to go lawless to protect the people who tried to criminally keep him in power in 2020?
Well, that's not the Donald Trump we know. Glenn, all of this raises the question, for example, if Donald Trump can use his own DOJ to extinguish the charges against him in the federal prosecutions, and he couldn't be prosecuted in state court while he was president, what about if these state courts just held off, kind of held their powder dry until he was out of office, and then boom, the Georgia prosecution would proceed against him, the Arizona prosecution could proceed against him, and on and on.
Yeah, that's a great loophole that you found. And a few minutes ago, I said he couldn't be prosecuted federally because he would control the Department of Justice, and he couldn't be prosecuted by the states, at least not while he was sitting president. Thereafter, if he hasn't, become the day one dictator and beyond that he has promised us he would become, if he actually did a 4-year term and then he was out of office, absolutely the state courts could, and I predict would, then restart their investigation. It would be then restart the prosecution. It would be on hold while he was a serving president, because you can't prosecute a sitting president, says the Department of Justice, and it would restart once Donald Trump left office. Now, there are a lot of ifs and buts, in that scenario that gets us back to a place where state courts are prosecuting Donald Trump after another 4-year reign of terror. But in theory, those state court prosecutions could proceed once Donald Trump left office.
And so let's finish off with this. What is your message then to people who want to see accountability for Trump, knowing full well that if he does get into office, all of those will basically vanish so long as he remains president?
Yeah, there are actually 3 solutions, I think, to cutting that problem off at the pass, and they are vote, vote, and vote, right? We talk about voting in numbers too big to rig and too real to steal. The other thing I would do, Brian, is urge people to vote early. The polls in Virginia opened a couple of weeks ago. My wife and I have already voted, and boy, did it feel good. And at least my completely unscientific observations were there were a whole lot of people grabbing sample Democrat ballots. So if we vote early, then I think there will be less of an opportunity for Donald Trump's, fake poll watchers to intimidate folks who show up on election day and try to cast their vote for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So vote, 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 and do it as early as your state permits.
And just to build on that, the campaigns themselves, Kamala's campaign knows who voted already. Obviously, people don't know how you voted, but if you're somebody who they're targeting as a Democrat, who they're watching as a Democrat, who may be a likely Democratic voter, they know whether you've cast your ballot or not. And so by virtue of voting early, they can then send their resources to people who are less likely voters, so they don't have to worry about you. So if you know that you're a guaranteed Democratic voter, don't wait, because that'll signal to the campaign that you've already got your ballot in. They can redirect those limited resources, that money, elsewhere to people who actually need it. So again, just to build on exactly what Glenn said, make sure to not only vote, but to vote early. Let the campaign focus their resources on people who actually are at risk of not turning out. But we will, of course, stay on top of all of this. For those who are watching right now to support both of our channels, the links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.